Breathing and exchange of gases. As you have read earlier, oxygen is utilized by organisms to indirectly break down simple molecules like glucose, amino acid, fatty acid, etc. to derive energy to perform various activities. Carbon dioxide, that is CO2, which is harmful, is also released during the above catabolic reactions. It is therefore evident that oxygen has to be continuously provided to the cells and CO2 produced by the cells have to be released out. This process of exchange of O2 from the atmosphere with CO2 produced by the cells is called breathing, commonly known as respiration. Place your hands on your chest. You can feel the chest moving up and down. You know that it is due to breathing. How do we breathe? The respiratory organs and the mechanism of breathing are described in the following section of this chapter. Respiratory organs. Mechanism of breathing vary among different group of animals depending mainly on their habitats and the levels of their organization. Lower invertebrates like sponges, coelentrates, flatworms, etc. exchange oxygen with CO2 by simple diffusion over their entire body surface. Earthworms use their moist cuticle and insects have a network of tubes, that is tracheal tubes, to transport the atmospheric air within the body. Special vascularized structures called gills, that is branchial respiration, are used by most of the aquatic arthropods and mollusks, whereas vascularized bags called lungs, that is pulmonary respiration, are used by the terrestrial forms for the exchange of gases. Among vertebrates, fishes use gills, whereas amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals respire through lungs. Amphibians like frogs can respire through their moist skin, that is cutaneous respiration also. Human respiratory system. We have a pair of external nostrils opening out above the upper lips. It leads to the nasal chamber through the nasal passage. The nasal chamber opens into the pharynx, a portion of which is common passage for food and air. The pharynx opens through the larynx region into the trachea. Larynx is a special cartilaginous box which helps in the sound production and hence called the sound box. During swallowing, glottis can be covered by a thin elastic cartilaginous flap called the epiglottis to prevent the entry of food into the larynx. Trachea is a straight tube extending up to the mid-thoracic cavity which divides at the level of the fifth thoracic vertebrae into the right and the left primary bronchi. Each bronchi undergoes repeated division to form the secondary and tertiary bronchi and the bronchioles ending up in a very thin terminal bronchioles. The tracheae, primary, secondary, and tertiary bronchi and the initial bronchioles are supported by incomplete cartilaginous rings. Each terminal bronchiole gives rise to a number of very thin, irregular walled and vascularized bag-like structure called alveoli. The branching network of bronchi, bronchioles, and alveoli comprise the lungs. We have two lungs, which are covered by a double-layered pleura with a pleural fluid between them. It reduces friction on the lung surface. The outer pleural membrane is in the close contact with the thoracic lining, whereas the inner pleural membrane is in contact with the lung surface. The part starting with the external nostril up to the terminal bronchioles constitute the conducting part, whereas the alveoli and the ducts form the respiratory or exchange part of the respiratory system. The conducting part transports the atmospheric air to the alveoli, clears it from the foreign particles, humidifies, and also brings the air to the body temperature. Exchange part is the site of actual diffusion of O2 and CO2 between the blood and atmospheric air. The lungs are situated in the thoracic chamber, which is anatomically an airtight chamber. The lungs are situated in the thoracic chamber, which is anatomically an airtight chamber. The thoracic chamber is formed dorsally by the vertebral column, ventrally by the sternum, laterally by the ribs, and on the lower side by the dome-shaped diaphragm. The anatomical setup of the lungs in a thorax is such that any change in the volume of the thoracic cavity will be reflected in the lung, that is pulmonary cavity. Such an arrangement is essential for breathing, as we cannot directly alter the pulmonary volume. Respiration involves the following steps. First, Breathing or pulmonary ventilation by the atmospheric air is drawn in and the CO2 rich alveolar air is released out. Second, diffusion of gases, that is O2 and CO2 across alveolar membrane. Third, transport of gases by the blood. Fourth, diffusion of oxygen and CO2 between blood and tissues. Fifth, utilization of oxygen by the cells for catabolic reaction and resultant release of CO2, that is cellular respiration, as dealt in chapter 14. Now, mechanism of breathing. Breathing involves two steps, that is inspiration, during which the atmospheric air is drawn in, and the expiration, by which the alveolar air is released out, and the movement of air into and out of the lungs is carried out by the creating a pressure gradient between the lungs and the atmosphere. Inspiration can occur if the pressure within the lungs, that is intrapulmonary pressure, is less than that the atmospheric pressure, that is there is a negative pressure in the lungs with respect to the atmospheric pressure. Similarly, expiration takes place when the intrapulmonary pressure is higher than that the atmospheric pressure. The diaphragm and a specialized set of the muscles, that is external and the internal intercostal muscles between the ribs, help in the generation of such gradients. Inspiration is initiated by the contraction of diaphragm, which increases the volume of the thoracic chamber in the anterior posterior axis, and the contraction of the external intercostal muscles lifts up the ribs and the sternum, causing an increase in the volume of the thoracic chamber in the dorsoventral axis. The overall increase in the thoracic volume causes a similar increase in pulmonary volume. An increase in pulmonary volume decreases the intrapulmonary pressure to less than the atmospheric pressure, which forces the air from the outside to move into the lungs, that is inspiration. Relaxation of the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles returns the diaphragm and sternum to the normal position and reduce the thoracic volume and thereby the pulmonary volume. This leads to the increase in intrapulmonary pressure to slightly above the atmospheric pressure, causing the expulsion of air from the lungs, that is expiration. We have the ability to increase the strength of inspiration and expiration with the help of additional muscles in the abdomen. On an average, a healthy individual breathes 12 to 16 times a minute. The volume of air involved in breathing movements can be estimated by using a spirometer, which helps in clinical assessment of pulmonary functions. Respiratory volumes and capacities. First, tidal volume, that is TV. Volume of air inspired or expired during a normal respiration. It is approx 500 ml, that is a healthy man can inspire or expire approximately 6000 to 8000 ml of air per minute. Inspiratory reserve volume, that is IRV, additional volume of air a person can inspire by forcible inspiration. This averages 25,000 ml to 2500 ml to 3000 ml. Expiratory reserve volume, that is ERV, additional volume of air a person can expire by a forcible expiration. This averages from 1000 to 1100 ml. Residual volume. Volume of air remaining in the lungs even after forcible expiration. This averages 1100 ml to 1200 ml. By adding up a few respiratory volume described above, one can derive various pulmonary capacities which can be lead in clinical diagnosis. Inspiratory capacities, that is IC, total volume of air a person can inspire after a normal expiration. This includes tidal volume, inspiratory reserve volume, that is TV plus IRV. Expiratory capacity, that is EC, total volume of air a person can expire after normal inspiration. This includes tidal volume, expiratory reserve volume, that is TV plus ERV. Functional residual capacity, that is FRC, volume of air that can remain in the lungs after a normal expiration. This includes ERV plus RV. Vital capacity, that is VC, the maximum volume of air a person can breathe in after a forced expiration. This includes ERV, TV, and IRV, or the maximum volume of air a person can breathe out after a forced inspiration. Total lung capacity, that is TLC, total volume of air accommodated in the lungs at the end of the forced inspiration. This includes RV, ERV, and TV, and IRV, or the vital capacity or plus residual volume. Now, exchange of gases. Alveoli are the primary sites of the exchange of gases. Exchange of gases also occur between the blood and the tissues. Oxygen and CO2 are exchanged in these sites by the simple diffusion, mainly based on the pressure and concentration gradient. Solubility of gases as well as thickness of the membranes involved in the diffusion are also some important factors that can affect the rate of diffusion. Pressure contributed by an individual gas in a mixture of gases is called the partial pressure and is represented as PO2 for oxygen and PCO2 for carbon dioxide. Partial pressure of these two gases in the atmospheric air and the two sides of the diffusion are given in table 17.1 and in the 17.3. The data given in the table clearly indicates a concentration gradient for oxygen from alveoli to blood and blood to the tissues. Oxygen 159 in atmospheric air. A gradient is present for CO2 in the opposite direction, that is from tissues to the blood and blood to the alveoli. As the solubility of CO2 is 20 to 25 times higher than that of the oxygen, the amount of CO2 that can diffuse through the diffusion membrane per unit difference in the partial pressure is much higher compared to that of oxygen. The diffusion membrane is made up of three main major layers, namely the thin squamous epithelium of alveoli, the endothelium of alveolar capillaries, and the basement substances that is composed of a thin basement membrane supporting the squamous epithelium and the basement membrane surrounding the single layer endothelial cells of capillaries in between them. However, its thickness is much less than a millimeter. Therefore, all the factors in our body are favorable for the diffusion of oxygen from alveoli to tissue and that of CO2 from tissue to alveoli. Transport of gases. Blood is the medium of transport for oxygen and CO2. About 97% of the oxygen is transported by RBC in the blood. The remaining 3% of the oxygen is carried in a dissolved state through the plasma. Nearly 20 to 25% of the CO2 is transported by RBC, whereas 70% of it is carried as bicarbonate. About 7% of the CO2 is carried in a dissolved state through the plasma. Transport of oxygen. Hemoglobin is a red-colored iron-containing pigment present in the form of RBC. Oxygen can bind with hemoglobin in a reversible manner to form oxyhemoglobin. Each hemoglobin molecule can carry a maximum 4 molecules of oxygen. Binding of oxygen with hemoglobin is primarily related to partial pressure of oxygen. Partial pressure of CO2, hydrogen ion concentration, and temperature are the other factors which can interfere with this binding. A sigmoid curve is obtained when percentage saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen is plotted against the partial pressure of oxygen. This curve, called the oxygen dissociation curve, and is highly useful in studying the effect of factors like partial pressure of carbon dioxide, H plus concentration, etc. on binding of oxygen with hemoglobin. In the alveoli, where there is high partial pressure of oxygen and low partial pressure of CO2, lesser H plus concentration, and the lower temperature, the factors are all favorable for the formation of the oxyhemoglobin. Whereas in the tissue, where the low pressure of the oxygen, high pressure of partial pressure of CO2, and the high H plus concentration and the higher temperature exist, and the condition are favorable for the dissociation of oxygen from the oxyhemoglobin, and this clearly indicates that oxygen gets bound to the hemoglobin in the lung surface and gets dissociated at the tissue. Every 100 ml of the oxygenated blood can deliver around 5 ml of oxygen to the tissue under a normal physiological condition. Transport of the carbon dioxide. CO2 is carried by the hemoglobin as carboaminohemoglobin, that is about 20 to 25%, and this binding is related to the partial pressure of the CO2. Partial pressure of the oxygen is the major factor which could affect this binding. When partial pressure of CO2 is high and the partial pressure of oxygen is low, as in the tissue, more binding of carbon dioxide occurs, whereas when the partial pressure of CO2 is low and partial pressure of oxygen is high, as in the alveoli, the dissociation of CO2 from carboaminohemoglobin takes place, that is CO2 which is bound to the hemoglobin from the tissue is delivered to the alveoli. RBC contain a very high concentration of the enzyme, that is carbonic anhydrase, and a minute quantities of same present in the plasma too. The enzyme facilitates the following reaction in the both directions. CO2 plus H2O, that is in the presence of carbonic anhydrase, H2CO3 in the presence of carbonic anhydrase, HCO3 minus plus H plus. At the tissue site, where the partial pressure of CO2 is high due to the catabolism, that is CO2 diffuses into blood, that is RBC and plasma, and forms bicarbonate and H plus. At the alveolar site where the PCO2 is low, the reaction proceeds in the opposite direction, leading to the formation of CO2 and H2O. Thus, CO2 trapped as bicarbonate at the tissue level and transported to the alveoli is released out as CO2. Every 100 ml of deoxygenated blood delivers about approximately 4 ml of the CO2 to the alveoli. Regulation of respiration. Human beings have a significant ability to maintain and moderate the respiratory rhythm to suit the demands of the body tissues. This is done by the neural tissue system. A specialized center present in the medullary region of the brain called the respiratory rhythm center is primarily responsible for this regulation. Another center present in the pons region of the brain called the pneumotaxic center can moderate the function of respiratory rhythm center. Neural signal from this center can reduce the duration of inspiration, thereby alter the respiratory rate. A chemosensitive area is situated adjacent to the rhythm center, which is highly sensitive to CO2 and hydrogen ions. Increase in these substances can activate this center, which in turn can signal the rhythmic center to make a necessary adjustment in the respiratory process by which these substances can be eliminated. Respiratory associated with the aortic arch and carotid artery also can recognize changes in CO2 and H plus concentration and send necessary signals to the rhythmic center for remedial actions. The role of the oxygen in the regulation of the respiratory rhythm is quite insignificant. Disorders of the respiratory system. Asthma is in difficulty in breathing, causing wheezing due to the inflammation of bronchi and bronchioles. Emphysema is a chronic disorder in which the alveolar valves are damaged, due to which respiratory surface is decreased. One of the major causes this is the cigarette smoking. Occupational respiratory disorder. In the certain industries, especially those involving grinding or stone breaking, so much dust is produced that the defense mechanism of the body cannot fully cope with the situation. Long exposure can give rise to the inflammation, leading to fibrosis, that is, proliferation of fibrous tissues, and thus causing serious lung damage. Workers in such industries should wear protective masks.